I want to discuss several implications of the first welfare theorem that you should be aware of. The first remark is that the first welfare theorem underlies the economist's widespread belief in using free markets. So there is a joke around a stereotype that if you ask an economist how to solve any social problem, any education problem, they would just tell you, create a market and let people trade. The environment, create a market and let people trade. Dating, create a market and let people trade. Research and development, create the right market and let people trade. That's a little bit of a caricature, but it's true that the economist's intuition about the power of the market is informed by the first welfare theorem, and in particularly on the idea that as long as it satisfies the assumptions that lead to the first welfare theorem that we're going to go through in detail in a second, there is no role for intervening in the market, for government policy, just for the purposes of improving efficiency, since the market already generates Pareto optimal allocations. There may be other reasons for intervening in the market, but it cannot be an efficiency motive. Second remark about the first welfare theorem that to me is extremely important is that the first welfare theorem shows that competitive markets lead to Pareto optimal allocations, and this is a key, at very low informational demands. Not only does the market, in other words, generates Pareto optimal allocations when it satisfies the assumptions of the competitive model, but it does so at very low informational demands. Let's think about this in detail. What is the information required by the market? The only information that is required is that each consumer needs to know its own U, its own utility function, and P, and the market price. And producers only need to know their own cost function or technology and P star. That's it. Given that everybody can optimize, and market forces will find a competitive equilibrium. So in other words, think about how beautiful this is. The market forces, when everybody's being selfish and maximizing the utility or the profits, the market forces lead to an allocation that is Pareto optimal, even though nobody knows the whole problem. Nobody really can sit back and compute what is the Pareto optimal allocation. The market forces, through the invisible hand of the market, lead you there. And that's amazing. To see why that is so amazing, suppose that instead you wanted to write this as a dictator. Require info for a dictator, as sometimes economists call dictators, a centralized social planner if they are benevolent and want to maximize some sort of social well-being. But imagine you have a central government agency that wanted to compute a Pareto optimal allocation. What would they need to know? They will need to know not only their own U, but all U's, all the utility function. They will need to know all cost functions. And by the way, as a parenthesis, they will have to compute a very hard optimization problem. So compare. If you use the market, very low information requirements. If you try to have a central government agency like the old Soviet Union used to have their quinquennial plans every 5 years about what to produce and how distributed, you need to know an enormous amount of information and solve a very hard computer science problem. That puts in light how remarkable is the market. Not only does it generate Pareto optimal allocations, it does so with very low and very realistic informational demands. One of the reasons that economists believe that these centralized economies fail is because this is not feasible. And it's not feasible for two reasons. It requires a lot of information that is almost impossible to gather because people will lie to you. They have incentives to lie to you. So you construct allocations that are better for them. And also it requires a very hard optimization problem that we don't quite know how to solve in real time. I want to conclude this video by highlighting what are the key assumptions behind the first welfare theorem and what happens when they break down. So let's do a table in which on the left-hand side we have what are the key assumptions, and the second is what are its consequences, what happens if they break down. So one key assumption is optimal decision making by firms and consumers. So we are assuming in the standard model that everybody is maximizing its true utility or its true production function. And what happens when that breaks out is that the first welfare theorem fails due to decision-making mistakes. So for example, if individuals are making decisions in a consistent way, but maximizing a decision utility function that is different from their true experience utility function, the allocation will no longer be Pareto optimal. And we have seen, for example, that this may be important to understand issues like marketing or myopia, low savings and things like that. And that's studied in a lot more detail in more advanced courses in economics, especially in behavioral economics. The other key assumption is that every actor, whether a consumer or a firm, is a price taker. Now, we have discussed this before, that this is a good assumption when every actor is a very small fraction of the market, so they really don't believe that they can influence prices. What happens when this fails? When this fails, you get something called imperfect competition, in which actors, especially firms, take actions with the knowledge that they can affect prices. This leads to situations like monopoly, oligopoly, or branding. It also leads to a first welfare theorem failure, but for different reasons. And in later units of the course, we're going to study what are the outcomes generated by markets in those cases. Another assumption is that there are no externalities. Now, an externality is when somebody's action enters directly in your utility function, even if you didn't trade with them. So for example, if you're sitting in your dorm and the person next door starts playing really loud music, that caused you harm and you didn't buy that from them. They just did it and it affected you. In contrast, when people trade to the market, the actions of someone else, let's say the butcher, only affect you through the act of trading with them. In the basic model, there are no externalities, there are no direct impact of the action of one consumer or one firm on another, and that generates to the first welfare theorem. When that fails, we're in a situation in which it's called public goods and externalities, in which the first welfare theorem fails again. And as we're going to see in the last unit of the course, this is very important for problems like environmental policy, environmental issues, or research and development, funding of universities, etc. The final critical assumption is that there is perfect information about the goods that are being traded. So in other words, for example, when you go to buy a car, you know exactly what its properties and quality are, and neither the seller nor the buyer know more than the other party. That's very important because when it breaks down, you have a situation called asymmetric information, in which people trade with the knowledge that one of them has more information than the other, and that makes the market fail, or the first welfare theorem fails again. Now, understanding this is very important for domains like insurance, used car markets, contracts, like for example, the contract with somebody who's renovating your house, etc. Okay? Now, in this course, we're going to look more at this and at this later on. We're not going to go in much more further detail into these two things. This is covered in areas like behavioral economics, and increasingly in an area called industrial organization. So you want to learn more, you can look at these areas. And this is covered a lot in areas called information economics and contract theory. Now, in order to study these things in detail, we'll have to go into models and mathematics that are well beyond the scope of this course. But I hope that the basic lesson is clear, which is that the model of the competitive market that we have developed has these 4 key assumptions. Every time they fail, the first welfare theorem fails. And therefore, in those cases, we need to understand what exactly that does to the properties of and the efficiency of the allocation generated in those markets.